A single root convinced a philosopher to never eat a meal without it. It was worth more than a live sheep in medieval England. Sailors grew it in clay pots to survive months at sea. A queen turned it into edible portraits of her guests, and one tax law nearly wiped it off the map forever. It wasn't gold, it wasn't oil, it was ginger. This knotted, ugly little rhizome, the one sitting in your kitchen right now, has been shaping human history for over 5,000 years. It's been medicine, currency, political weapon, and the reason entire fleets crossed oceans. But here's the strangest part. Ginger doesn't exist in the wild. Not anywhere on Earth. Every single ginger plant alive today is there because a human being planted it. So the question isn't really what ginger is. The question is, why did we refuse to let it disappear? This is the history of ginger. Most plants have a wild ancestor. Wheat has wild grass. Apples have wild crab apples. Corn has teosinte. You can trace them back to a field, a forest, a mountainside where they grew without any human help. Ginger has none of that. Botanists have searched. They've traced its closest relatives to the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia, probably the islands of modern Indonesia or Malaysia. But no one has ever found a wild ginger plant. Not one. That means at some point, thousands of years ago, a group of people looked at this strange knobby root, decided it mattered, and took responsibility for its survival. They carried it with them. They planted it wherever they went, and if they'd stopped, ginger would have vanished from the earth. The people who carried it first were the Austronesians. They were among the most skilled seafarers the ancient world ever produced. Starting around 3000 BCE, they sailed outrigger canoes from island to island across the Indo-Pacific, covering distances that European explorers wouldn't attempt for another 4,000 years. They didn't travel light. They carried taro, breadfruit, coconuts, and ginger. Each plant served a purpose, but ginger was special. It settled stomachs on rough seas. It preserved meat in tropical heat. It could be dried and stored for months. When you're sailing a wooden outrigger into open ocean with no guarantee of return, you bring what keeps you alive. Ginger made the list. Imagine what that required. Before each voyage, someone had to dig up ginger rhizomes, wrap them, store them in the hull. When they landed on a new island, someone had to plant those rhizomes, tend the soil, wait for the plants to grow, and harvest enough to carry forward to the next island. Every landing was a decision. Do we keep this plant alive, or do we let it go? They kept it. Every single time. The Austronesians spread ginger from Southeast Asia as far as Hawaii to the east and Madagascar to the west, covering a range of over 10,000 miles. But ginger's future would be defined by two civilizations where the Austronesians' cargo took deep, permanent root: India and China. In India, ginger became medicine, not folk remedy, not kitchen superstition. Formal, systematic medicine. The Ayurvedic tradition, at least 3,000 years old, classified ginger as a warming agent that strengthened digestion. Practitioners called it the universal medicine. Fresh and dried ginger were treated as different substances with different therapeutic strengths. Both were prescribed constantly, but it was the Sanskrit name that would travel furthest. They called ginger Shringavra, horn body, because of its lumpy, antler-like shape. That word passed through ancient Greek as zingiberis, then into Latin as zingiber, and eventually into English as ginger. Every time you say the word ginger, you're speaking a fossil of a 5,000-year-old trade route. In China, ginger followed a parallel path. Traditional Chinese medicine classified it as a yang tonic, warm, energizing, capable of driving out cold and dampness. Chinese healers prescribed it for nausea, stomach pain, colds, and joint problems. But ginger wasn't just for the sick. One of the most famous men in Chinese history couldn't eat a single meal without it. And that small detail would echo across centuries. Around 500 BCE, the philosopher Confucius sat down to eat. According to the Analects, the foundational text of Confucian thought compiled by his disciples during the Warring States period, Confucius had a rule. He was never without ginger when he ate. Every meal, without exception. This wasn't a casual preference. Confucius was a man who believed every daily action carried moral weight. How you dressed, how you spoke, how you sat. Everything communicated something about your character, and for Confucius, a meal without ginger was an incomplete act. The Analects describe him as fastidious about food. He wouldn't eat meat that wasn't cut properly. He wouldn't drink wine bought from the market. He wouldn't eat rice that had gone sour. But ginger was always there. It was the one constant on his table. Think about the influence of that detail. Confucius's teachings shaped Chinese civilization for over 2,000 years. His writings became the basis of government examinations, moral education, and social conduct across East Asia. Emperors studied him. Scholars memorized him. His habits became aspirational. His preferences became norms. So when Confucius, this pillar of Chinese thought, treated ginger as non-negotiable at the dinner table, an entire civilization paid attention. Ginger wasn't just a spice anymore. It carried the endorsement of the most respected teacher in Chinese history. That's the kind of marketing no amount of money can buy. But here's a question that won't be answered for another 2,500 years. Why does ginger actually work? Confucius observed that it aided digestion and kept the body balanced, but he couldn't explain the mechanism. He didn't know about bioactive compounds or inflammatory pathways. He just knew it worked. That answer, when it finally arrived, would involve laboratories, mass spectrometers, and molecular biology. We'll get there. But first, ginger had to cross oceans. 9 centuries after Confucius, a Buddhist monk named Faxian recorded something remarkable. In 406 CE, he documented that Chinese sailors were growing ginger in clay pots aboard their ships. Not storing it, growing it. Living plants tended at sea. The sailors believed ginger prevented scurvy, the disease that killed more sailors than storms, pirates, and warfare combined. They were right, though they didn't know why. Ginger contains modest amounts of vitamin C. But more importantly, its anti-inflammatory properties and ability to settle violent nausea made it essential for men spending months on open ocean. Picture that. Centuries before European navies figured out that citrus fruit could save their crews, Chinese sailors were already keeping themselves alive with potted ginger plants on the deck of a ship. While Chinese sailors carried ginger eastward, another group of people was carrying it west. Arab and Persian merchants controlled the overland and maritime spice routes. They moved ginger from India through the Red Sea, past the ancient Egyptian harbor of Berenice, and into the Mediterranean world. These merchants were strategists. They understood a rule that luxury brands still follow today. Mystery creates value. If your customer knows where the product comes from and how easy it is to get, they'll negotiate the price down. But if the source stays secret, you control the market. So the Arab merchants lied, deliberately and systematically. They told their European and North African buyers that ginger grew in lands guarded by venomous serpents. They claimed the soil where ginger sprouted was too dangerous for outsiders to reach. They spun stories so vivid that Greek and Roman writers repeated them as fact. For centuries, not decades, centuries, the actual origin of ginger remained one of the most carefully protected trade secrets on Earth. The merchants who moved it were the only people in the Western world who knew where it actually grew, and they planned to keep it that way. This deception had real consequences. European buyers assumed ginger was rare because it came from dangerous, inaccessible places. They paid accordingly. A merchant who could get ginger from India for one price and sell it in Rome at 20 times that price had every incentive to keep lying. And so the lies continued, passed down from trader to trader, generation after generation. Around 25 BCE, Emperor Augustus actually invaded the Arabian Peninsula, at least partly to try to cut out these middlemen and secure direct access to spice sources for Rome. The invasion failed. The merchants kept their secrets, and ginger kept getting more expensive. By 150 CE, ginger was flowing into the Roman Empire in significant quantities. But the supply was still controlled, the source still secret, and the prices still extraordinary. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing his famous De Materia Medica in the 1st century CE, praised ginger as a digestive aid and warming tonic. He said it softened the belly and warmed the stomach. He noted it was imported both dried and candied, preserved in honey for wealthy Roman households. That candied ginger was among the most expensive edible luxuries available in the ancient Mediterranean. His contemporary Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, also wrote about ginger, but Pliny couldn't figure out what it actually was. He suggested ginger might be the root of the pepper plant. It wasn't, but that mistake reveals how effectively the Arab merchants had hidden the truth. Even Rome's greatest naturalist, a man who cataloged thousands of natural substances, was guessing about the basic identity of one of the empire's most popular imports. A century later, the physician Galen, perhaps the most influential medical writer in Western history, added his own assessment. He described ginger as an imported root that generated heat in the mouth, but more gradually than pepper. Even Galen, who had access to the best information in the Roman world, referred to ginger as coming from the barbaric land. Vague, mysterious, unlocatable. The merchant's deception held firm. How expensive was ginger in Rome? During the reign of Emperor Diocletian around 301 CE, ginger appeared on official price lists. Price caps meant to control inflation. University of Toronto economic historian John Munro calculated that at Diocletian-era prices, a pound of ginger represented roughly 5,000 days of labor for a common worker. That's over 18 years of wages, for 1 pound of dried root. At those prices, ginger wasn't a spice. It was closer to a financial instrument. When Rome crumbled, the trade routes didn't vanish. They shifted. New powers inherited the ginger trade, and those new powers would ask a question that the merchants who sold ginger didn't want anyone asking. Where does it actually come from? And how do we get it ourselves? That question, when Europe finally demanded an answer, would launch ships, topple monopolies, and redraw the map of the world. But first, ginger had to become something even more powerful than medicine or food. It had to become a symbol of who you were. Here's a comparison that will stay with you. In 14th century England, a pound of ginger cost the same as a live sheep. You could walk into a market, hand over a bag of dried root, and walk away with a bleeding animal. How did a plant that grows freely in tropical soil become worth a living creature in a northern European market? 2 monopolies stacked on top of each other. Arab traders controlled the route from Asia to the Mediterranean. They set the first markup. Venetian merchants controlled distribution from the Mediterranean into Europe. They set the second. By the time ginger reached London or Paris, it had passed through enough hands that the final price was astronomical, and nobody could break the chain. Because nobody in Europe knew where ginger actually grew. That extreme scarcity turned spices into something beyond food. They became power made visible. At aristocratic banquets across Europe, hosts didn't just serve spiced dishes, they staged spectacles. Fountains flowed with wine infused with ginger, cloves, and cinnamon. The scent filled the hall before guests even sat down. Pie crusts were brushed with saffron until they gleamed gold. The message was blunt. This household controls enough wealth to waste the most expensive substances on earth. In 15th century London, a skilled master mason earned about 8 pence a day, a solid wage. At those prices, a pound of ginger cost about a day and a half of his labor. A pound of pepper cost over 2 days. A pound of saffron cost an entire month. But ginger wasn't just for banquets. It was still medicine. Hildegard of Bingen, the 11th century German mystic and healer, used ginger as the foundation of tonics, antiseptics, and digestive preparations. Medieval apothecaries stocked it alongside their pharmaceutical supplies and dispensed it for stomachache, rheumatism, and poor circulation. And yes, ginger was also prescribed as an aphrodisiac. The 12th century medical school at Salerno promoted it for exactly that. Medieval healers followed the doctrine of signatures, the idea that a plant's shape revealed its purpose. Ginger's suggestive form made the connection easy. Ayurvedic texts had made the same claim centuries earlier. Whether it worked is debatable. The belief was not. The most extreme display of spice wealth we have documented happened in 1475. The wedding banquet of Duke George the Rich of Bavaria and Jadwiga of Poland consumed 386 pounds of pepper, 286 pounds of ginger, 257 pounds of saffron, and over 200 pounds of cinnamon. That was a political statement served on plates. Every pound said the same thing: we are richer than you. Then Marco Polo returned to Venice. After 25 years traveling through Asia, his account, Il Milione, described markets overflowing with pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger. He described them as common goods, available in enormous quantities, traded openly. For European readers, this was maddening. The spices they were paying fortunes for were apparently plentiful at the source. The markup wasn't about scarcity, it was about access. Venice and the Arab intermediaries were charging astronomical sums for goods that were common in Asia. Then, in 1453, the situation got worse. The Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople, the gateway between Europe and the overland Asian trade routes. The spice supply chain, already controlled by Arab intermediaries, became even harder for European merchants to access. Prices spiked, availability dropped. Portugal, Spain, and England each drew the same conclusion. Whoever found a direct sea route to those eastern markets, bypassing both Venice and the Ottoman-controlled overland routes, would control the most profitable trade on Earth. National treasuries, royal prestige, and economic survival were now tied to finding a new way east. And that desperation, driven as much by ginger as by pepper or cinnamon, launched the most consequential era of exploration in human history. In 1497, a Portuguese navigator named Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and approximately 170 men. His mission was simple in concept and brutal in execution: sail around the southern tip of Africa and reach India by sea. Why? Because Venice and the Arab traders had locked Europe out of the spice supply chain. Portugal wanted to cut them out entirely. The voyage took 10 months. Storms battered the fleet rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The crossing of the Indian Ocean, over 4,500 miles of open water, took 23 days. Crew members developed scurvy. Their gums bled. Their teeth loosened. Their skin broke into sores. By the time Da Gama anchored at Calicut on India's Malabar coast in May 1498, he'd buried dozens of sailors at sea. Nearly half his crew would eventually die during the expedition, but he'd made it. He was the first European to reach India by sea. And what did he find when he arrived? Markets filled with the very spices that Europeans had been paying fortunes for. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and ginger, stacked in bulk, sold openly, available in quantities that would have stunned a Venetian merchant. Da Gama returned to Portugal with a message from the ruler of Calicut. He was willing to trade cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and pepper for gold, silver, and scarlet cloth. The Portuguese crown calculated the margins. The return on investment was staggering, even after the cost of ships, crews, and the inevitable losses at sea. Within decades, Portugal had built a network of fortified trading posts along India's coast. They didn't ask permission. They used naval cannons to enforce their position. When local rulers resisted, Portugal responded with warships. The spice trade stopped being commerce and became colonialism, the first wave of European empire building driven directly by the desire for flavoring. But Portugal wasn't alone in recognizing ginger's potential in the New World. When Spanish colonists arrived in the Caribbean, they discovered that ginger thrived in the region's tropical soil. The Spanish crown actively encouraged its cultivation. They wanted their own supply, independent of the Asian routes. By the mid-1500s, ginger was growing on Hispaniola and Puerto Rico. Jamaica became the prize. The island's volcanic soil, reliable rainfall, and humid climate produced ginger that European traders considered the finest in the Western Hemisphere. Its flavor was sharper, more complex, more aromatic than anything coming from Asia. By the mid-16th century, Jamaica was exporting enormous quantities back to Spain. Then, in 1655, England took Jamaica by force. Oliver Cromwell launched the Western Design Expedition, a fleet of warships sent to seize Spanish Caribbean territory. The assault on Hispaniola failed embarrassingly, but the fleet sailed on to Jamaica, where a smaller Spanish garrison couldn't hold. England now controlled the Caribbean's most productive ginger fields, and they weren't gentle about it. Consider what this meant in practice. For the first time in history, a European power didn't need to buy ginger through middlemen. England grew it, harvested it, shipped it, and sold it, all within its own colonial system. Over 2 million pounds of Jamaican ginger crossed the Atlantic every year. But that production had a human cost. Caribbean ginger and sugar plantations depended on the labor of enslaved Africans. The people who actually planted, tended, and harvested the ginger that England consumed never shared in the profits. The root that had once been carefully carried by Austronesian seafarers who chose to cultivate it was now being grown under compulsion by people who had no such choice. That ginger, shipped in barrels across the Atlantic, would fuel English kitchens, apothecaries, and eventually an entirely new cultural tradition, one that started with a queen who had very unusual taste in dessert. But before Elizabeth, there was her father. Henry VIII reigned from 1509 to 1547, and he was obsessed with his own mortality. After a severe jousting accident in 1536, he developed chronic leg ulcers that never properly healed. He battled headaches, constipation, and swollen joints. He grew enormously overweight. And he was terrified of plague. Plague struck London repeatedly during Henry's reign. Major outbreaks hit in 1509, 1516, 1528, and again in the 1540s. Henry's response was almost manic. He moved his court from palace to palace, sometimes daily, sending messengers ahead to check whether towns along the route were infected. He refused to see anyone who'd been near plague cases. His apothecary records, some of the earliest detailed English pharmaceutical documents to survive, list ginger preparations among the remedies dispensed to the royal household. Spiced wine infused with ginger, known as hippocras, was consumed at the Tudor court and considered medicinal. Ginger conserve appears in English royal apothecary records as early as the 1240s, during the reign of Henry III. By the Tudor era, ginger was thoroughly embedded in English medical practice. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was one of the most trusted tools in a physician's kit. And in a century when medicine was largely guesswork, trust mattered enormously. Henry's daughter, though, she wasn't interested in ginger as medicine. She saw something else entirely. She saw a tool for political performance. Queen Elizabeth I loved spectacle. Her banquets were legendary. Marzipan shaped like fruit, castles, and birds decorated the tables. Her court employed a dedicated royal gingerbread maker, and during one particularly memorable feast, Elizabeth ordered something extraordinary. She had her pastry chefs bake gingerbread cookies shaped like people, not generic people, specific people, foreign dignitaries, members of her own court. Each cookie was decorated to resemble an actual guest sitting at her table. Imagine being a visiting ambassador. You sit down at the queen's table, you look at your plate, there's a cookie shaped like you, staring back. And you're expected to eat it. According to Carol Levin, director of the Medieval Studies program at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, this was Elizabeth's version of diplomatic theater. A demonstration of power disguised as hospitality. She knew your face well enough to bake it. That's a message. The trend escaped the palace walls. Practitioners of folk medicine, sometimes called witches or magicians, began baking gingerbread men as love charms. If a young woman could convince the man she wanted to eat a gingerbread man baked in his image, he would supposedly fall in love with her. Shakespeare captured the craze. In Love's Labour's Lost, the clown Costard says a line that tells you exactly how deeply gingerbread had penetrated ordinary English life. Even the poorest character in the play wants it. In the Netherlands, gingerbread men became so culturally powerful that the city of Delft actually banned them on religious grounds. Authorities worried that baking and consuming human-shaped cookies crossed a theological line. Ginger had become controversial. A spice that started as medicine was now entangled with superstition, romance, and religious anxiety. And here's the answer to a question you might not have thought to ask. How did gingerbread, a luxury spice product reserved for aristocrats, become a cookie that children decorate at Christmas? The path is traceable. Elizabeth's edible portraits popularized the human shape. Folk practitioners turned them into love charms. German bakers refined the recipe and made gingerbread houses after the Brothers Grimm published Hansel and Gretel in 1812, a story featuring a house made of sweets. European immigrants brought gingerbread traditions to America, and there, gingerbread merged with Christmas customs to become the holiday staple it remains today. Ginger didn't just travel the spice routes, it traveled through culture, from Queen's Table to Witch's Kitchen to fairy tale to Christmas tree. Each step of the journey gave ginger a new identity and a new reason to survive. But ginger's most explosive commercial transformation was still ahead, and it started in a pub. By the mid-18th century, ginger had been medicine for 3,000 years, currency for 1,000, and political theater for 200. Now it became a drink. Ginger beer was born in Yorkshire, England, around the 1750s. The recipe was remarkably simple: crushed ginger, sugar, water, and yeast. Fermentation produced a fizzy, slightly alcoholic drink, usually between 2 and 11% alcohol. The timing wasn't an accident. Two ingredients that had been expensive for centuries were suddenly available in bulk. England controlled Jamaica's ginger fields. Sugar was pouring in from Caribbean plantations. When cheap ginger met cheap sugar in a country that already had a brewing culture, ginger beer was inevitable. And it was wildly popular. Not aristocrat popular. Everybody popular. For the first time in ginger's history, it wasn't a luxury, it was ordinary. Think about what that meant. For thousands of years, ginger had been something only wealthy people could afford. Now a laborer in Manchester could drink it after work. A street vendor in London could sell it for pennies. A family in Yorkshire could brew it in their kitchen using a simple recipe passed down from a neighbor. By the mid-1800s, ginger beer had become one of the most widely consumed beverages in the English-speaking world. The numbers tell the story. Over 4,000 dedicated ginger beer breweries were operating across Great Britain. More than 1,500 were running in the United States and Canada. It appeared in newspapers, in novels, in advertisements. It was the drink of the working class, and the working class loved it. Then, in a single legislative stroke, the British government nearly killed it. In 1855, Parliament passed the Excise Act. Before the law, ginger beer largely escaped alcohol taxation because the threshold for taxable alcohol was set above what most ginger beers contained. After the law, the threshold dropped to 2%. Overnight, ordinary bottles of homemade ginger beer were classified alongside rum and whiskey. The tax didn't just increase costs, it made small-scale production economically impossible. Thousands of home brewers and small breweries couldn't absorb the new expense. They shut down. The drink that had conquered Britain was suddenly in retreat. But ginger wasn't finished with beverages. It adapted. In the 1850s, an Irish apothecary named Thomas Joseph Cantrell created a non-fermented, carbonated ginger drink in Belfast. Sweeter, milder, golden-colored? No fermentation meant no alcohol tax. He called it ginger ale. Decades later, a Canadian named John McLaughlin created a paler, drier version. The style most of the world recognizes today. Then came American Prohibition in 1920. With alcohol banned nationwide, speakeasies needed mixers that could disguise the harsh taste of bootleg liquor, whiskey distilled in bathtubs, gin cooked up in back rooms, spirits that could strip paint off a wall. Ginger ale was the answer. Sweet enough to mask rot gut, fizzy enough to seem festive, and completely legal to buy, sell, and carry. Bartenders across America poured it over ice alongside whatever bootleg spirits they could source. Ginger ale became the unofficial drink mixer of the Prohibition era. It survived the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, transitioned into mainstream cocktail culture, and never left. Ginger had reinvented itself again. From ancient medicine to medieval luxury to Georgian pub staple to Prohibition cocktail mixer. Every time its previous identity collapsed, it adapted, found a new form, a new audience, a new reason to exist. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, ginger had been quietly woven into a culinary tradition you've almost certainly experienced yourself. And if you've been doing it wrong, you're about to find out. In Japan, ginger became something precise and deliberate. Japanese cooks developed gari, paper-thin slices of young ginger, pickled in rice vinegar and sugar. The name comes from the Japanese onomatopoeia gari gari, the crunching sound the slices make when you bite them. The tradition of serving gari alongside sushi goes back to the Edo period, between 1603 and 1868, when sushi was sold as street food. Gari served a specific functional purpose. It cleansed the palate between different pieces of fish. Each variety of fish has subtle flavors. Eating ginger between bites resets your taste buds so you can appreciate the next piece fully. That's why, at a proper sushi restaurant, you don't pile ginger on top of your fish. You eat a thin slice between pieces. It resets your taste buds so each piece of fish arrives on a clean palate. It also has natural antimicrobial properties, which mattered enormously in an era before refrigeration. The color of traditional gari is a pale, natural pink. That's not from dye. Young ginger contains anthocyanin pigments that turn pink when exposed to rice vinegar. The bright, artificial red you sometimes see in cheap takeaway containers? That's food coloring. Real gari is subtle. Stacking ginger onto nigiri is the sushi equivalent of pouring ketchup on a steak. You can do it. The chef will notice. In India, ginger never needed reinvention. It never fell out of favor, never became a novelty, never required a comeback. For thousands of years, straight through from the Ayurvedic tradition to tonight's dinner, ginger has remained foundational. Fresh ginger is pounded into a paste with garlic and onions to form the flavor base of countless curries. It's grated into chai, especially during monsoon season and winter. It's chewed raw after meals for digestion. In Indian cooking, ginger isn't an ingredient you add. It's an ingredient you start with. But here's the question this documentary has been building toward without explicitly asking it. How did ginger, something once worth a live sheep, guarded by merchant lies, fought over by empires, become something you can buy for a few dollars at any grocery store on Earth? The answer unfolded across 5 centuries. And it's one of the most dramatic price collapses in the history of food. First, colonization broke the supply monopoly. When the Spanish and then the English planted ginger in the Caribbean, they created a new source outside Arab and Venetian control. For the first time, European buyers could get ginger without paying the middlemen who'd controlled the trade for 1,000 years. Prices started falling. Second, tropical cultivation spread far beyond the Caribbean. Ginger grows in any humid tropical environment with well-drained soil. Once European colonial powers realized this, they planted it in West Africa, East Africa, South America, and across Southeast Asia. Every new planting region added supply. Every new harvest pushed prices down further. Third, independence changed the economics. When former colonies gained sovereignty in the 20th century, countries like India and Nigeria developed their own ginger industries, not to feed European demand, but to build domestic economies. Production scaled dramatically. India alone now produces approximately 2.3 million tons of ginger per year, roughly 45% of the entire world's supply. Nigeria follows with about 764,000 tons. China produces around 673,000 tons. Globally, ginger production has grown from about 60,000 tons in 1961 to 4.8 million tons by 2024. That's an 80-fold increase in just over 60 years. The global ginger market is now worth over $7 billion, but the price per pound has collapsed relative to wages. What once cost a medieval craftsman a day and a half of labor now costs a modern worker a few minutes. Ginger is still one of the most traded spices on Earth. It's still medicine, still flavor, still culture, but it's no longer scarce, and that accessibility, more than anything, is why you've probably got some in your kitchen right now. The question that remains is the one Confucius couldn't answer 2,500 years ago. Why does ginger actually work? For 5,000 years, every civilization that encountered ginger reached the same conclusion. It works. It eases nausea. It warms the body. It reduces pain. It settles the stomach. They were right, they just didn't know why. The answer is a compound called 6-gingerol. It's the most abundant bioactive molecule in fresh ginger root, and it's responsible for the spicy heat you taste when you chew raw ginger. When ginger is dried, some of that gingerol transforms into 6-shogaol, a compound with even stronger effects. Modern clinical trials have confirmed what Confucius intuited, what Ayurvedic healers prescribed, and what Chinese sailors depended on. Ginger is effective against nausea, from motion sickness, from chemotherapy, and from pregnancy. Germany's Commission EE, the government body that regulates herbal medicine, has officially approved ginger for preventing motion sickness. Beyond nausea, researchers have found that ginger's compounds target the same inflammatory pathways as common anti-inflammatory drugs. Studies published in journals including Nature Reviews Rheumatology have shown that gingerol can reduce markers of inflammation in models of arthritis and autoimmune disease. Think about what that means. For 5,000 years, across dozens of cultures, languages, and medical traditions, people prescribed ginger for roughly the same set of problems: nausea, inflammation, digestive distress, joint pain. They couldn't explain why it worked. They couldn't isolate the molecule. They just observed the result and kept prescribing. And they were right, every single time. 5,000 years of human instinct, confirmed by a mass spectrometer. And that brings us back to the deepest mystery in ginger's story. Remember, ginger doesn't exist in the wild. It never has, as far as anyone can tell. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, a group of people in Southeast Asia looked at a plant that couldn't survive without them and decided to keep it alive. They carried it onto boats. They planted it on new islands. They tended it through storms and droughts. Then India found it could heal. China found it could sustain. Arab merchants found it could make them rich. Rome found it could demonstrate power. Medieval Europe found it could signal status. Elizabeth I found it could charm diplomats. Yorkshire found it could quench thirst. Japan found it could cleanse the palate. Every civilization that touched ginger found a new reason to keep growing it, a new use, a new meaning. Each generation handed it to the next. Not because anyone told them to, but because ginger kept proving itself indispensable. 5,000 years. Dozens of civilizations. One ugly root. And we're still choosing it. Still planting it. Still eating it with our meals. Just like Confucius. The next time you hold a piece of ginger at the grocery store, turn it over in your hand. Look at the knobs and ridges, the horn body that gave it its Sanskrit name. Remember that this thing was once worth a sheep, that a philosopher refused to eat without it, that merchants lied for centuries to protect its source, that a queen shaped it into portraits of her guests, that sailors grew it in pots to stay alive at sea, that a single tax law nearly erased its most popular form. And remember this, every ginger plant alive on Earth is only alive because 5,000 years of humans decided, generation after generation, that this ugly little root was worth keeping. You're holding all of that in your hand for about $2. But ginger wasn't the only spice that convinced entire nations to cross oceans. There's another one. Nutmeg, a spice so valuable that the Dutch traded an entire island to the English to keep control of it. That island was Manhattan. That story is linked right here. And if you want more stories where ordinary things carry extraordinary histories, subscribe. We put out a new one every week. Thanks for watching.